I want to thank Erin, Richard, and everybody at AAKP for this opportunity. My role is to discuss the role of the APOL1 gene in kidney disease and lead that into the field of transplantation for Dr. Moxie Mims to follow on. I think everyone on this call knows that the rates of kidney disease are much higher in the African American population than any other population. If you compare it to the white population, the Asian American, the Native American population, African Americans face threefold higher risk of end-stage kidney disease than all of the other groups. In fact, that is nearly fully explained by that single APOL1 gene differences between racial and ethnic groups. With the patients that we often see with this disease have long been described as having hypertensive kidney failure or just end-stage kidney disease in the chart. For many years, we didn't know the real cause of kidney disease. And here's a middle-aged African-American woman who's thin, did not have diabetes, didn't have much protein in the urine, and was told her kidney failure was from high blood pressure, when in fact, it's an inherited disease from the APOL1 gene. So this paper was published in the journal Science in 2010. We're celebrating its 10th year discovery of the APOL1 gene. The APOL1 gene is the single most powerful gene associated with a common human disease ever found. It just happens to be a kidney disease. And if you look at that picture, you see the blue parasites swimming in the bloodstream, surrounded by the red blood cells of a patient who's infected with African sleeping sickness. And it turns out that the changes in the APOL1 gene, which initially were found only in sub-Saharan Africa, could kill certain of these parasites. Yet, although they protected people from these forms of African sleeping sickness, which led them to live longer and get transmitted to next generations, one thing that was not known until 2010 was that these protective variants from the parasitic disease caused kidney disease. And people who get one copy of the risk gene from their mother and one from their father, so two copies of the risk gene, are at very high risk for getting kidney disease. And those risk variants are virtually limited to the African American population. So we now know that the reason many different kidney diseases have clustered in tightly in many Black families. So for those of you in AAKP who have multiple relatives on dialysis, some of whom may have thought they had high blood pressure induced kidney failure, others with glomerular diseases like FSGS, others with HIV associated nephropathy or COVID-19 associated nephropathy, lupus causing kidney disease or sickle cell disease, we now know that those two changes in the APOL1 gene, one from your mother, one from your father, puts you at risk for all of these different diseases. All are non-diabetes associated forms of kidney disease. All are much more common in the African American community. So to put this gene in perspective, 13% of all African Americans have two copies of the risk variants, which put them at high risk for kidney disease. That's more than 5 million African Americans. And those individuals probably have a 15 or 20% chance of getting kidney disease. However, most of them, 80 to 85%, will not get kidney disease. Another 39% of all African Americans have one copy of the APOL1 risk variant, which means they're carriers and can transmit that one copy of the risk variant to half of their children. So, if two people with one variant have a child, there's a 25% that child will get two risk variants and be at risk for kidney disease. But these variants are not present in whites, Asians, Hispanics, and they explain why African Americans are at such higher risk of kidney disease. Matter of fact, 70% of all cases of FSGS and HIV nephropathy in the African American population would never occur if it weren't for these variants in the APOL1 gene. That's how powerful they are. And we now know that more than one of every 3 African Americans on dialysis, so if you're from Los Angeles, Birmingham, Alabama, Chicago, New York, or North Carolina, and you walk into a dialysis unit, one of every 3 African Americans on dialysis has kidney failure from this gene. And it explains much of that excess risk for kidney disease. It explains why African Americans have more and more severe kidney disease when they get lupus compared to other groups. And it also explains why kidneys donated from African Americans fail more quickly after transplantation. And I'm going to show you that data. It's been known for a long time that if someone receives a kidney from an African-American deceased donor, the kidneys after transplant don't function for as long as kidneys donated by any other ethnic group. It doesn't matter the race of the recipient of the kidney, it's the donor race. And nobody knew why for years and years. APOL1 changed our understanding. This is a study that we did at Wake Forest very early on, 1 year after discovery of the gene relationship with kidney disease. And I want you to see there's two groups there. Those are all African-American deceased donor kidney transplants. They're all Black. That the group on top in blue, APOL1 non-risk, had 0 or 1 copies of the risk variants, and their transplants did extremely well over 7 years. But the African-American group in red at the bottom had 2 copies of the risk variants in the donated kidney. And look how quickly they failed. This explains the fact that it is not the race of the donor, it's their APOL1 genotype, because all these donors were Black. This study met with tremendous pushback because it was done at Wake Forest, a single center study and a small number of donors. So we then reached out to other transplant programs and we studied more than 1,150 deceased donor kidney transplants, whose kidneys came from 624 different African-American deceased donors. These were done at 113 different kidney transplant centers. And you can see at 6 years, the group that transplants from donors with 2 risk variants in APOL1 were twice as likely to fail as kidneys donated by African Americans with less than 2 copies. The APOL1 genotype of the donor is determining the outcomes after the transplant, not the race of the donor. This is critically important because the way kidneys are given out for transplantation is there's a risk score to know how risky that donor kidney is to match recipients who are healthy with the best quality kidneys or recipients who are maybe not as healthy with lower quality kidneys, so the kidneys last as long as that recipient needs. And there are 10 factors that are calculated to determine what is the risk. One of the 10 is if you're African American or not. Well, that is totally inappropriate. When we know the actual gene causing the change, we shouldn't use a social construct such as race. So we went back and we did the study in the 1,153 deceased donor kidney transplants, replacing the risk based on African American race with the genotypes which we knew. I'm just going to end here by showing that in the current allocation, the way deceased donor kidneys are given out, this is those 1,153 transplants I just showed you. They have about a 70% risk factor, which means those kidneys were estimated to function worse than more than 70% of all the kidney transplants done in the prior year. You can see if you have 0 or 1 risk variant, it's 71%, or 2 risk variants, 69. They're all about the same, 70% risk. But that's assuming the donor was Black. If we take that out and we insert APOL1 genotype, look at the change. The 71% falls to 53%. That means those kidneys are average. They're perfectly good. They're not high risk. They function, worse than about half of all kidneys transplanted. They're average. But if the donor had 2 risk variants, they're much worse than 70%. They're actually worse than nearly 90% of all kidney transplants. Well, why is that important? Because 87% of the time, those kidneys are much better than currently estimated. It's only 13% of the time that they're high-risk kidneys that are going to fail more quickly. So we can improve the quality score in 87% of donated kidneys, and we think that'll make them less likely to get discarded. They're perfectly good for transplant, and they'll help many people. And my last slide shows, as we've talked about with Lori's story, African-American donors of kidneys are at higher risk for getting kidney disease than any other racial or ethnic group. And it was unclear why Black donors had more kidney disease after donating. And this is a study from Mona Doshi that works with Lori that showed, and Mariella Goggins is a co-author on this study, that showed that after African Americans donated and their genotypes were looked at long-term follow-up, there was higher risk of kidney disease and more severe kidney disease in the donors who had 2 copies of APOL1 than in the low-risk group. So in fact, APOL1 explains a tremendous amount of kidney disease in the Black community and appears to play a very important role in outcomes after transplantation.